The fever broke on a Tuesday, but the silence that followed in the sod cabin was more terrifying to Elara Vance than the child's burning skin had been. For 7 days, she had fought the invisible fire in her 9-year-old son. Benjamin, with tepid claws and whispered prayers, the howling Wyoming wind a constant choir to her desperation. Now, lying on his cornhusk mattress, his breath a shallow flutter, he was simply too weak to eat. The last of the oat porridge had been finished 2 mornings prior. The last potato, a shriveled, precious thing, was gone. The jar of venison talloy, meant for the deepest winter, showed only a greasy smear at the bottom. Her husband's rifle, leaning by the door, was useless. The game had gone high into the frozen bighorns a month ago, and her own shots, weeks back, had only scared shadows. Benjamin was dying of the aftermath, of the hollow. Relentless nothing that follows a body's war. Elara, at 30, had a face that spoke of prairie sun and squinted horizons. But her gray eyes, the color of a winter creek, were now etched with a fear that no landscape could inspire. Her hands, chapped and strong from tending a stubborn homestead alone since her husband Silas vanished on a supply run 8 weeks prior, trembled as she smoothed Benjamin's hair. The cabin, their proud claim of 2 years, felt like a tomb of packed earth and rough-hewn logs, buried under a sky the shade of dirty wool. The knock, when it came, was not a neighbor's familiar rap. It was a hard, deliberate thump-thump-thump that vibrated through the thick plank door. Elara's heart slammed against her ribs. No one came this far up the creek this time of year. She glanced at the rifle, then at Benjamin. Moving silently, she peered through a crack in the shutter. 2 men stood in the relentless wind, their horses head down and weary. They were not cowboys. The older one, tall and gaunt as a stripped pine, had a face of severe angles under a broad-brimmed black hat, his eyes dark and depthless. He wore a long charcoal coat, frayed at the cuffs, that spoke of travel, not ranch work. The younger one, bulky in a buffalo coat, had a restless energy, his gloved hands flexing at his sides. His gaze swept the homestead with a cold assessment that missed nothing: the empty woodpile, the snow-covered garden plot, the chimney issuing only the thinnest wisp of smoke. "Hello, the house." The tall man called, his voice a dry rasp like stones grinding. "Seeking shelter from the wind. Have coffee to trade." Elara's mind raced. Coffee was worth more than gold right now, a stimulant, a bit of warmth. But every instinct in her body coiled tight. She cracked the door, the freezing air biting her face. "My son is sick," she said, her voice raw. "We've no room." The tall man's eyes slid past her into the gloom of the cabin. "A sick child needs warmth. We've beans, too. A handful for a place by your fire for an hour. We'll tend our own horses." It was a bargain whispered by the devil himself. Beans, protein, sustenance, she saw. Benjamin's sunken cheeks in her mind. With a stiff nod, she stepped back. They entered, bringing the cold with them like a second skin. The younger one, who the tall man called Harlan, stomped snow onto her packed earth floor, his eyes darting from the meager hearth to the corner where Benjamin lay. The tall man introduced himself as Jeremiah Coates. He set a small sack of coffee beans and a cloth pouch of dried beans on her table with a deliberate slowness that felt like a performance. "Bad time to be alone out here," Jeremiah said, not taking off his hat. He leaned against the wall near the fireplace, his presence making the small room feel smaller. "My husband will return shortly," Elara lied. Moving to block his view of Benjamin, Harlan gave a short, humorless laugh. "That so? Saw a man's body froze into a creek bend 2 miles south. Wore a checkered wool coat." The world tilted. Silas's coat. Elara's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled sound escaping. Grief, sharp and absolute, lanced through her. but it was immediately cauterized by a more primal terror. They were alone, truly alone. And these men knew it. Jeremiah watched her, no sympathy in his gaze. A tragedy. Makes you vulnerable. He pushed off the wall and took a single step toward Benjamin's corner. Boy looks poorly. What ails him? Fever, Elara whispered, her body tensing like a spring. Needs nourishment. Jeremiah mused as if diagnosing a lame horse. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a strip of jerked beef. The smell of salt and smoke filled the air. Benjamin, in his haze, moaned and turned his head weakly toward the scent. It was the most conscious movement he'd made in days. "Here, boy," Jeremiah said, taking a step closer. "Don't," Elara said, stepping between them. "His stomach. It's too weak. It'll make him sicker." She knew this was true. Giving rich food to a starved person could kill them as surely as the hunger itself. Jeremiah's dark eyes locked onto hers. A faint, chilling smile touched his lips. "I'm just trying to help, ma'am." He tore a small piece of the jerky off. "A little won't hurt. Gotta get his strength up." This was no act of charity. It was a test. A demonstration of power. They weren't here to rob her. She had nothing. They were here for something else, and their cruelty was a tool. Harlan moved to the table, picking up the pouch of beans they'd just given her. He hefted it in his hand. "Course, for medicine, you need a strong fire. Need fuel." He looked pointedly at the near-empty wood box. "You're out. Boil freeze by morning." Elara understood the trap. They had offered sustenance, then immediately created a scenario to take it away, to worsen their condition, to make her complicit in her son's decline. They wanted her desperate. They wanted her broken. Jeremiah still held the jerky piece. Benjamin, eyes half open, stared at it with a pathetic, instinctual longing. "Please." Elara begged, the word ash in her mouth. "Leave the beans. Take the coffee back. Just go." Jeremiah ignored her. He leaned down, bringing the meat close to Benjamin's face. "It's good. Go on." With a cry that was part sob, part roar, Elara threw herself at Jeremiah, clawing at his arm. He straightened up easily, shoving her back with such casual force she stumbled into the table. Harlan caught her by the arm, his grip vice-like. "Now, that's no way to treat guests," Jeremiah murmured. He dropped the piece of jerky onto Benjamin's blanket. Then, with a calm finality, he took the pouch of beans from Harlan, opened it, and poured the hard, dried beans, each one a tiny promise of life, into his hand. And then directly onto the low-burning fire. The beans hissed and popped in the flames, a sickening sound of waste. The smell of burning starch mixed with the savory jerk. "What's the real problem?" Jeremiah said, dusting his hands. "You'll need to go fetch some, now, before dark." He nodded to Harlan, who released Elara and moved to stand over Benjamin, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "My associate will keep the boy company. You go on. Bring back a proper load. Then we'll talk about what you can do to earn some real food for him." Elara stood frozen, her soul screaming. They were sending her out into the freezing wilderness, holding her son hostage. To refuse was to watch Benjamin starve tonight. To go was to leave him with wolves. Jeremiah opened the door, the glacial wind screaming into the cabin. "Best hurry, Mrs. Vance. Light's fading." Looking into Benjamin's terrified, glassy eyes, Elara made her choice. She pulled her thin shawl tight, took the hatchet from the block, and stepped out into the blinding, white hell. The cold was a physical assault. It stole the breath from Elara's lungs and needled through her worn wool dress as if it were gossamer. The wind, funneled down from the mountain passes, scoured the desolate creek bottom, whipping the snow into stinging, crystalline clouds. She stumbled toward the sparse copse of skeletal cottonwoods 100 yards from the cabin. her boots crunching through the crusted snow. Each step away from Benjamin was an agony, a tearing of her spirit. Behind her, the sod cabin was a dun-colored mound in the white expanse, its single window glowing faintly with the fire's meager light, a beacon that now felt like a jail cell's lantern. She pictured Harlan's bulky frame by Benjamin's bed, the revolver, the casual malice in his eyes. And Jeremiah Coates, with his stone-carved face and calculated cruelty. What did they want? They hadn't touched the few trinkets of value, her mother's locket, Silas's spare rifle. This was not about theft. It was about domination, about the sport of breaking something. Or, a darker thought whispered, they were waiting for something. Or someone. The hatchet felt pitifully light in her hand. The cottonwoods were deadfall, hard and icy. She swung, the impact jarring her bones, the sound a sharp crack swallowed by the wind. Her tears froze on her cheeks. Every thunk of the blade was a countdown in her mind. How long did Benjamin have? The fire was low. The cold inside would be creeping back. And the jerky. If he ate it. She worked with a frantic, desperate strength, her breath coming in ragged plumes. The wood she split was green and frozen, useless for a quick, hot fire. It would mostly smoke. She gathered it anyway, her arms aching as she piled the clumsy lengths together. She needed a plan. She couldn't return with poor wood and no strategy. They would just send her out again, or worse, Dot, as she bent to tie a leather cord around the bundle. Her eyes caught a disturbance in the snow near the base of a larger tree, a scuffle of tracks too small for a man. Partially filled with fresh snow, but recent. A rabbit? Her hunter's instincts, dulled by fear, flickered. She followed the trail a few yards to a brush pile, a tumble of fallen branches and dead sage. And there, hidden in a hollow beneath, was a snare. Dot, it was old. One of Silas's, the braided horsehair cord stiff with frost. And it held a prize. A snowshoe hare, frozen solid, its body stiff in the noose. It hadn't been there yesterday. She checked this line every 3 days, hope dwindling. The storm must have driven it down. It was meager, but it was meat. A broth. Real nourishment she could control. A wild, defiant hope surged in her chest. She hacked the snare free and stuffed the rigid carcass into the inside of her dress against her stomach. The cold of it was a shock, but it was a secret. A tiny piece of leverage. Dot, she hefted the bundle of sorry wood and turned back toward the cabin. The light in the window seemed to pulse like a malevolent eye. She forced her mind to work. Jeremiah was the thinker. Harlan was the brute. They had the guns, the position. She had surprise, desperation, and a frozen rabbit. Dot, as she approached the door, it opened before she could knock. Jeremiah stood there, his tall frame blocking the interior. His eyes went from her wind-raw face to the pathetic bundle of green wood. "That's a poor effort for a boy's life," he said quietly, but his gaze was probing, looking for something in her expression. "It's what's there," she said, her voice flat. "The wind's taken the deadfall." She stepped past him, her body screaming with tension. Inside, the air was scarcely warmer than outside. Harlan had dragged a stool next to Benjamin's bed. The piece of jerky was gone from the blanket. Elara's heart seized. Did he eat it? She demanded, dropping the wood with a clatter. Harlan smirked. "Took it right from my fingers. Gobbled it down. Boy's got spirit." Rage and terror flooded her. She rushed to Benjamin, kneeling. He was asleep or unconscious, his breathing still shallow. She placed a hand on his belly, feeling for the distension, the cramping that would come. Nothing yet. But it would. "He needs water," she said, more to herself. She stood, going to the water bucket. It was low. She dipped a cup. "We've been talking," Jeremiah said, settling into Silas's chair by the fire as if he owned it. "About your situation. A widow now, it seems." A boy to feed. This claim is too isolated, dangerous. A man could get hurt out here. He spoke slowly, each word a brick in a wall she was meant to see herself behind. We represent interested parties in Cheyenne. Land speculators. This creek bottom has value you can't see. We're prepared to offer you a deal. Sign over the deed to this quarter section, and we'll see you and the boy safe to Fort Casper. With a stipend. $50. It was a pittance. Less than the land was worth even now. And it was a lie. Men like this didn't offer deals. They orchestrated tragedies and then scooped up the pieces. They'd found Silas's body. They'd come to insure the rest of the Vance family simply disappeared, leaving the land free for the taking. The fever and starvation would be a sad footnote. No one would question it. They weren't trying to worsen Benjamin's condition out of pure sadism, though that was a part of it. They were making their story real. A starving sick boy, a distraught mother, a winter storm. The pieces were falling into place around her. Elara stared into the sullen fire, the frozen rabbit a secret weight against her skin. The beans they'd burned were a final symbol. They had shown her they controlled all sustenance, all hope. Their offer was the only exit they would permit. She turned to face them, letting the utter helplessness they expected show on her face. I need to tend to my son. Your offer, I need to think. Jeremiah nodded, a predator satisfied the trap was closing. Think by morning. The weather's turning worse. Your boy may not see another noon without proper care we can provide. Elara moved to Benjamin, her back to the men. As she pretended to adjust his blankets, she slipped the frozen hair from her dress and concealed it beneath the edge of his cornhusk mattress. The cold secret was now his, a promise lying next to him. The long, terrible night began. The green wood smoked and sputtered. Jeremiah and Harlan took turns dozing, watching, always watching. Elara sat rigid in a chair, her eyes on Benjamin, waiting for the jerky to wreak its havoc. The men shared a flask, it smelled sharp and medicinal in the close air. They spoke in low tones about cattle prices, about a boom town in the Dakota Territory, callous conversations that underscored their transient, predatory nature. Just before dawn, Benjamin groaned. His body went rigid, then he vomited, a dry, painful heaving that brought up nothing but bile and a shred of undigested meat. The smell was acrid. Elara was there instantly, holding his head, wiping his mouth with a cloth, her body shielding him from their view. See? Harlan grunted from the shadows. Told you he was weak. The vomiting turned to gut-wrenching cramps. Benjamin cried out a thin, animal sound of pain. Elara's soul wept, but her mind grew colder, sharper. This was the crisis. They had forced it, and they would use it now to break her dot. As the first gray light seeped through the shutters, Jeremiah stood. He's failing, Mrs. Vance. Sign the paper. We have a wagon not far. We can get him to a doctor, or... He let the alternative hang in the frigid air, mingling with the scent of sickness and smoke. Benjamin trembled violently in her arms, his eyes rolling back. It was the performance of his life, spurred by true agony. Elara looked from her son's racked face to the deed paper Jeremiah now placed on the table, a bottle of ink and a pen beside it. She had one move left. One desperate, dangerous play, born of a frozen rabbit and a mother's wrath. Get him some fresh air, she whispered, her voice breaking with feigned defeat. Just for a moment, please, before I sign. Let him breathe something that isn't this sickness. Jeremiah studied her. He saw a woman shattered. He nodded to Harlan. Take the boy to the door. Keep him wrapped. Harlan, with a look of disgust at the sickbed, roughly bundled Benjamin in his blanket and carried him the few feet to the door. Propping the boy up just inside the threshold, holding him under the arms. Benjamin's head lolled, his face as pale as the snow outside. This was it. Elara walked slowly to the table, picking up the pen. She dipped it in the ink. Her hand hovered over the paper. She looked at Jeremiah, who watched with the cool focus of a gambler seeing his winning hand revealed. Then she threw the inkpot dot. It sailed through the air in a spinning arc. Not at Jeremiah, but at the miserable, smoking fire. The ceramic shattered in the flames. The small amount of ink sizzled. But it was the oil in the ink that mattered. It was the shock of the act. For one fraction of a second, both men's eyes jerked to the sudden sputtering flare in the hearth. Elara didn't go for the rifle by the door. It was too far, and Harlan was too close. Instead, she lunged for the one thing they'd forgotten about, the tool she'd carried back from the woods. The hatchet, left beside her bundle of green wood dot in 2 strides, she had it in her hand. Harlan, turning back from the door, still holding Benjamin, had no time to draw his gun. With a guttural cry that held all her fear, her grief, her rage, Elara swung the hatchet not at Harlan, but at the doorframe beside his head. Thwack! The blade buried deep into the wood, an inch from his ear. Harlan flinched violently, his grip on Benjamin loosening. The boy, with a surge of adrenaline born of terror, twisted and fell to the floor, scrambling away on his hands and knees. Jeremiah was faster, his hand flashing to his hip. But Elara was already moving. She yanked the hatchet free and brought it down on the table, splitting the deed paper in 2 with a dramatic rip. "Get out!" She screamed, the sound tearing her throat. She raised the hatchet again, her eyes wild. "You want this land? You'll have to kill me for it in front of God in this snow. And then explain my body and my boys to the cavalry patrol that checks this line next week." It was a bluff. She had no idea when a patrol might come. But the force of her fury, the sudden reversal from broken woman to avenging spirit, gave it weight. Harlan, his hand on his gun, looked uncertainly at Jeremiah. The older man's face was a mask of cold fury. He had misjudged her. The calculation in his eyes was rapid. Killing her now was messy. A hatchet fight. A boy as a witness. Bullets that would need explaining. Their plan had relied on quiet coercion, on the slow grind of nature and despair. This was neither quiet nor slow. "You've chosen a hard death for him," Jeremiah hissed, his hand still on his revolver. "It was the only choice you left me," Elara spat, positioning herself between the men and Benjamin, who was now crouched by the hearth, staring with wide, awestruck eyes. For a long, frozen moment, the only sound was the whimpering wind and the crackle of the fire. Then, with a contemptuous sneer, Jeremiah slowly raised his hands, palms out. "Easy, woman. No need for more dramatics. The deal is off." He nodded to Harlan. "Mount up." They backed out of the cabin, never turning their eyes from her. Elara stood, hatchet in hand, chest heaving, until she heard the crunch of hooves on snow, fading into the wind. She dropped the hatchet, its clatter loud in the sudden silence. Then she collapsed to her knees, pulling Benjamin into her arms. He was crying, soft, shuddering sobs. "The rabbit, Mama," he whispered against her neck. "Under the bed." "I know, my heart," she murmured, rocking him. "I know." The battle was won, but the war was not over. They were still alone, still starving, still in the heart of the killing winter. And the men who wanted their home were still out there, somewhere in the white vastness. The true cost of this victory was yet to be tallied. The silence after the men left was a physical presence, thick and fragile as ice on a pond. Elara held Benjamin until his shivering subsided, not just from cold but from the aftershock of fear and sickness. The jerky had done its damage. He was weaker than ever, a doll with glass eyes. "Stay here," she whispered, laying him back on the mattress. With trembling hands, she retrieved the frozen hair from its hiding place. It was a stiff, gray lump, but it was life. She stoked the fire with the last of the usable wood, ignoring the green smoke, and set her largest tin pot filled with snow to melt. Using Silas's skinning knife, she worked with efficient, desperate movements, peeling back the hide, sectioning the meager flesh, cracking the bones for marrow. Every scrap went into the pot as the water began to simmer, the cabin filled with a smell that was almost holy, the simple, savory scent of cooking meat. Benjamin watched from his bed, a faint light returning to his gaze. While the broth simmered, Elara moved to the door, securing it with the heavy bars Silas had fashioned. She peered through a crack in the shutter. Their tracks led south, back down the creek bottom, already being erased by the drifting snow. They were gone for now. But Jeremiah Coates did not strike her as a man who accepted failure. He would recalculate. He would return, or he would send others. The deed was still torn on the table, but the land was still a target. She returned to the hearth. The broth was a thin, pale gold. She skimmed a tiny cupful, let it cool, and brought it to Benjamin. "Sips," she instructed, her voice soft but firm. "Just little sips." He obeyed, the warm liquid pausing in his throat before he swallowed. He didn't retch. A few minutes later, she gave him a little more. Then she allowed him a single small piece of the tender, boiled meat. He chewed slowly, his body accepting the offering like parched earth accepting raindrop as he ate. Strength seemed to seep back into him by degrees. Not the strength of health, but the strength to remain present. "The tall man," Benjamin whispered, his voice reedy. He said Pa was in the creek." Elara's heart clenched. She nodded, brushing his hair back. "I think it's true, my love. He wanted us to go away." "He did. Are we going to go away?" Elara looked around the sod cabin, the walls they had built. The hearthstone Silas had hauled from the creek. The patchwork quilt her mother had sent from Ohio. It was the shell of a dream, now filled with ghosts and threats. But it was also their shelter. Out there was the vast, frozen unknown. Here, at least, they had four walls and a secret. "No," she said, the word settling something inside her. "We are not going away. But we cannot stay here like this." A plan, raw and dangerous, began to form in her mind. It was born of the same stubbornness that had made her swing a hatchet next to a killer's ear. Jeremiah expected a starving widow and a dying boy. He expected despair. He would not expect action. When Benjamin slept, a true, nourished sleep, Elara moved. She took Silas's rifle from its place. She checked the load, her fingers familiar with the action. It was a .50 caliber Sharps, a relic of his brief stint as a buffalo hunter. It had a kick like a mule and could drop an elk at 300 yards. She had never fired it at a man. The thought made her stomach turn, but she pushed it down. She gathered the remaining cartridges, only 6, and stuffed them into her pocket. Next, she went to the hidden floorboard under their bed, the settlement safe. From it, she took the family Bible, her mother's locket, and the packet of important papers, the land deed, their marriage certificate, Benjamin's birth record. She wrapped them in oilcloth. She also took the $50 in scrip Silas had left for emergencies, the money he'd been meant to use for supplies. It felt like blood money now. She then did the hardest thing. She took the quilt from Benjamin's bed and her own thickest shawl. Using Silas's knife again, she cut and ripped them into long, thick strips. She worked through the fading afternoon light, her hands moving with a frantic purpose. Benjamin woke as she was finishing. "Mama, what are you doing?" "We're going on a trip, Ben," she said, forcing calm into her voice. "A cold trip. I need you to be the bravest you've ever been." She helped him sit up. She dressed him in every layer he owned: two thin shirts, his wool jacket, his patched trousers. Over it all, she began to wrap the strips of quilt and shawl, swaddling his limbs and torso until he looked like a bundled, shapeless cocoon, leaving only his face exposed. She did the same to herself over her dress and coat, creating a crude, padded insulation against the cold. They would look ridiculous. They would be slow. But the quilt batting, trapped against their bodies, might just hold enough warmth to keep frostbite at bay. She packed the remaining rabbit broth and meat in a small lard pail. She slung the rifle over her shoulder by a strap. The packet of papers and the money went inside her wrappings, against her chest. She gave Benjamin the last of the broth to drink, feeling the clock tick in her veins. They had to move before full dark, and before Jeremiah decided to return. "Where are we going?" Benjamin asked, his eyes huge. "To the ice caves," Elara said, his breath caught. The ice caves were a local wonder and hazard, a series of limestone caverns a mile up the creek where meltwater froze into fantastic, permanent shapes. Silas had taken him once, in summer, warning him of the deep cold wells within. It was a place children dared each other to go, a place of whispered stories. It was also a place no sane person would seek in winter. "No one will look for us there," Elara explained, helping him stand. He was unsteady, but the food had given him a ghost of strength. "And the caves?" "The deepest ones stay at a constant temperature. Colder than here, but out of the wind. We can hide." She opened the door. The wind had died momentarily, leaving an eerie, crystalline stillness. The world was monochrome white, gray, and deepening blue. The cold was absolute, a vacuum that threatened to suck the warmth from their lungs. She took Benjamin's bundled hand. They left the cabin door unlocked. Let Jeremiah find it empty. Let him wonder. Their trail would be obvious at first, but the drifting snow would help. She supported Benjamin as they trudged away from the creek, angling up a steep, snow-covered slope dotted with granite boulders and skeletal pines. The going was agonizingly slow. Benjamin stumbled often, his breath coming in ragged, tearful gasps. Elara pulled, coaxed, and sometimes half-carried him. The rifle on her back was a clumsy weight. Behind them, the cabin shrank into a dark smudge against the white. After an hour, Benjamin could go no further. He slumped against a tree, weeping silently. Elara's own strength was fraying. The cold seeped through their wrappings. She looked back. Their trail was a ragged scar in the snow, leading straight to them. They were exposed. "Just a little further, Ben. See that dark line in the cliff?" She pointed to a shadowed seam in the rock face ahead, partially curtained by a frozen waterfall. He nodded, too tired to speak. They reached the cave mouth as the last light bled from the sky. The entrance was a jagged maw, hung with icicles like teeth. Inside, the world changed. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of water somewhere in the deep dark. The air was still and frigid, but it lacked the wind's knife edge. Using a strip of cloth soaked in the last drippings of tallow from the cabin, Elara fashioned a crude torch with a stick from her bundle. She struck a match from Silas's tin. The flame caught, throwing wild, dancing shadows on the walls of glittering ice and wet stone. They picked their way inward, past pillars of frozen flowstone, over floors of slick rock. Elara remembered Silas's warning about pits and drop-offs. She moved with extreme caution, holding the torch high. They found a small side chamber, about 10 feet deep, its floor of dry sand. It was like a stone cocoon. The temperature was perhaps just above freezing, but compared to the world outside, it felt almost temperate. Exhausted, they collapsed onto the sand. Elara broke the last of the rabbit meat, giving most to Benjamin. She ate a few tough shreds herself. She propped a torch in a crack where it guttered and smoked. In its dim light, she saw Benjamin was already asleep, his bundled form rising and falling with deep, exhausted breaths. She sat with the rifle across her lap, listening. The cave whispered its ancient, damp secrets. Somewhere water dripped. The torch flame wavered and then, from the direction of the entrance, carried on the still air, came a new sound. Faint, but unmistakable. The whinny of a horse. Elara's blood turned to ice in her veins. She crept to the mouth of their side chamber, peering down the tunnel toward the entrance. Flickering orange light torch or lantern light bobbed against the cavern walls. Muffled voices echoed, distorted by the ice. "Tracks lead right here, Yer. Crazy bitch brought the kid into a godforsaken ice hole." Harlan's voice. "She's smarter than I credited," King Jeremir's reply, closer now. "Out of the wind, hiding, but she's trapped herself. No back door in this one." They were inside the cave system. Elara retreated silently to Benjamin. She shook him gently, covering his mouth as he woke. His eyes widened in terror at her expression. She put a finger to her lips, then pointed to the deepest, darkest corner of their chamber. He understood, crawling into the shadows, pulling his wrappings around him until he was just another lump in the gloom. Elara looked at the guttering torch. Its light was a beacon. Its smoke, a telltale sign. She had two choices: let it burn and reveal them, or plunge them into absolute darkness and hope the men missed. Darkness swallowed them. It was not the dark of a moonless night, but an absolute velvet blackness that pressed against Elara's eyes. She could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, the slow, ragged draw of Benjamin's breath from the corner. She crouched behind a shoulder of rock at the chamber's entrance, the Sharp's rifle cold and heavy in her hands. Her finger found the trigger guard. A familiar curve in the void. The lantern light from the main cavern grew stronger, painting the ice walls of the tunnel outside in shimmering, malevolent gold. Shadows leapt and danced like devils. "Spent torch," Harlan grunted, his voice now alarmingly clear. Elara pictured him picking up the stick she'd discarded. "Fresh, they're in here." "Fan out," Jeremir's voice commanded, calm and lethal. "Check the side chambers. She's armed with a rifle, remember. Don't give her a clean shot." Boots crunched on grit and ice. The light splintered as one of them, Harlan, she guessed, moved away with a torch. Jeremir's lantern light remained dominant, hovering at the junction just outside her hideaway. She could see the glow of it on the floor. Creeping closer, she pressed herself flatter against the rock, making herself small. The chamber was a shallow pocket. If either man took 2 steps inside and held his light high, they would be discovered. Benjamin's bundled form might pass for a rock in the poor light, but not if inspected. And she would be seen. Harlan's voice echoed from a chamber further down. "Nothing here. Just a drop-off." "She ain't that stupid." Jeremir didn't answer. Elara heard the soft scrape of his coat against the wall. He was right outside. The lantern light flooded the entrance to her chamber, illuminating the sand floor, the wall opposite. In a second, he would step into the opening. Elara made her choice. It was not the choice of a homesteader or a widow or a victim. It was the choice of a cornered animal protecting its young. She took a deep, silent breath, stood up, and stepped into the mouth of the chamber. Bringing the Sharp's rifle to her shoulder in one fluid motion, the barrel pointed directly at the source of the light. Jeremir Coate stood 6 feet away, holding a bull's-eye lantern. The bright beam caught her full in the face, blinding her for an instant, but she held her ground. His own features were in shadow behind the light, but she saw his shoulders tense in surprise. "Drop the lantern," Elara said, her voice echoing strangely in the cavern. It did not sound like her own. It was low, steady, and left no room for debate. A slow smile spread across Jaramir's shadowed face. "Or what, Mrs. Vance? You'll shoot me? You're a farmer's wife. That's a buffalo gun. It'll knock you on your back, and the sound in this cave will deafen you and your boy for life." "The first part is my concern," Elara said, not lowering the rifle. "The second part is yours." "Drop it. He didn't move." "Where's the boy? Did the cold take him already?" That would simplify things. Rage, white-hot and pure, flashed through her. He was probing for weakness, for a distraction. She refused to take the bait. Last chance. From the darkness down the tunnel, Harlan's voice called out, "Yer? You got her?" "I've got her," Jaramir called back, his eyes locked on Elara. "She's got the sharps. Don't come in blundering." He took a half-step forward. Elara's finger tightened on the trigger. The pull was heavy. She had never fired it before. Silas had said to squeeze, not pull. "You won't," Jaramir whispered, taking another step. He was now 4 feet away. The lantern light glared in her eyes. "You're not a killer. You're a mother hiding in a hole." He was right. She wasn't a killer. But in that moment, she saw the creek bend where Silas's body lay frozen. She saw the beans sizzling in her fire. She saw Benjamin retching from the poisoned charity. She saw the torn deed on her table. "No," she said, her voice finally cracking with emotion. "I'm the mother you left with no other choice." She shifted the barrel an inch to the left and squeezed the trigger. The world exploded. The sound was not a crack but a boom.